the annals of American crime, some names echo through time as symbols of brutality, cruelty, or a singular descent into darkness. But there's others whose stories are quieter, less known, and yet more disturbing. At the turn of the 20th century, when the field of nursing was still developing and medicine was making its first great strides into the modern age, one woman built a career on trust, care, and the promise of comfort. But behind her smiling face, and beneath the surface of her professional reputation, she carried a secret. Her name was Jane Toppan. To those who knew her, she was Jolly Jane, a cheerful nurse who seemed devoted to her patients. But in time, investigators would discover that she was also one of America's most prolific serial killers, a woman who confessed to at least 31 murders, and who may have claimed the lives of more than 100. This is her story. Jane Toppan began life under a different name. She was born Honora Kelly on March 31st, 1854, in Boston, Massachusetts, the daughter of Irish immigrants. Her mother, Bridget Kelly, died young, a victim of tuberculosis. Her father, Peter Kelly, was known in Boston as an eccentric and often violent alcoholic. His drinking and his behaviour earned him a cruel nickname amongst his neighbours, Kelly the Crack, short for crackpot. In later years, rumours spread that he once sewed his own eyelid shut while working as a tailor. Whatever the truth of that story, what is certain is that his household was chaotic and dangerous. By 1860, just a few years after his wife's death, Peter Kelly gave up his two youngest daughters, 8-year-old Delia Josephine and 6-year-old Honora, to the Boston Female Asylum, a home for destitute girls. The asylum records noted that the children had been rescued from a very miserable home. Their father would never see them again. The fate of the Kelly children paints a bleak picture of immigrant life in 19th century Boston. One daughter, Nellie, who did not go to the asylum, would later be committed to an institution for the insane. Delia, once she left the orphanage, struggled with alcoholism and drifted into prostitution. Honora, the youngest, would walk a different path, one that began with an act of reinvention. In November of 1862, Honora was placed as an indentured servant in the home of Mrs. Anne C. Toppan of Lowell, Massachusetts. She was never legally adopted, but she took the Toppan surname and left behind the memory of her birth family. From that time forward, she will be known as Jane Toppan. The Toppan household was more stable than the one she left. Jane grew up alongside the Toppans' daughter, Elizabeth, and by all accounts, their relationship was cordial. But beneath the surface, Jane developed traits that others would later describe as both brilliant and terrible: a keen mind, a quick tongue, and a tendency towards falsehoods. In 1885, at the age of 31, Jane Toppan began training as a nurse at Cambridge Hospital. It was here that she earned the nickname that would follow her for the rest of her life, Jolly Jane. Her outward personality seemed warm, friendly, and even endearing. She had a quick smile and a way of making patients feel comfortable in her presence. Colleagues often described her as bright and sociable, but as she gained the trust of those around her, Jane also began to reveal a darker side. She took an unusual interest in her patients. She favoured those who were elderly or gravely ill, and she began conducting experiments on them in secret, using the drugs readily available in the hospital. She adjusted dosage of morphine and atropine to observe their effect on the nervous system. These were not scientific experiments conducted for the sake of knowledge or discovery. They were acts of cruelty, tests on living, vulnerable human beings. Jane altered medical charts, invented symptoms, and sometimes pushed her patients into states of near death before reviving them again, just to prolong their suffering. Worse still, she often spent long periods alone with her victims, sitting at their bedsides as they drifted in and out of consciousness. Reports later suggested that she climbed into bed with some of them, holding them close as they slipped towards death. In 1889, Jane was recommended for a position at Massachusetts General Hospital, one of the most respected medical institutions in the country. But even there, suspicions began to arise. Several patients died under unusual circumstances, and Jane's reckless use of opiates eventually led to her dismissal. She returned briefly to Cambridge Hospital, but was soon let go for similar reasons. By this time, Jane's career in formal institutions was finished, but she had discovered a new opportunity: private nursing. Families welcomed her into their homes, trusting her to care for their loved ones. In these private settings, her methods grew bolder and her crimes more numerous. Jane's killing spree began in earnest in 1895. Her first victims were her landlords, Israel and Lovely Dunham. Israel, aged 83, died in May of that year. 2 years later, in 1897, his wife also perished under Jane's care. At first, these deaths attracted little attention. Both victims were elderly, and their passing seemed natural. But Jane was growing more confident, and her methods more deliberate. In 1899, she turned her attention closer to home. That August, she poisoned her foster sister Elizabeth Brigham with a dose of strychnine. Elizabeth had been, by most accounts, a stabilizing presence in Jane's life. Her death would later be seen as a deeply personal act, one that may have been driven by jealousy or resentment. Soon after, Jane killed Elizabeth's housekeeper, Florence Calkins, and then a patient named Mary McNear. In January of 1900, she claimed 2 more lives: William Ingram, another patient, and Florence's husband. A month later, her friend Sarah, also known as Myra Connors, succumbed to poison. By this point, Jane's reputation as a private nurse remained strong, but the deaths surrounding her began to mount up. Her most notorious series of killings came in the summer of 1901, when she moved into the household of Alden Davis. Jane arrived at the Davis home after the death of Alden's wife, Maddie. Officially, she was there to care for the grieving widower and his family. In truth, she had already murdered Maddie Davis on July 4th, 1901. Within weeks of moving in, Jane poisoned Alden himself, as well as his sister Edna and 2 of his daughters, Minnie and Genevieve. The deaths were shocking in both their number and their swiftness. What had seemed like a household struck by sudden tragedy was in fact the work of one woman. But Jane had grown careless. When Minnie Gibbs died in August, her family demanded a toxicology examination. The results confirmed that she had been poisoned. For the first time, suspicion turned directly towards Jane Toppan. On October 29th, 1901, Jane was arrested for murder. The arrest was followed quickly by a confession, one that stunned even seasoned investigators. By 1902, she admitted to at least 31 murders. Privately, she suggested that the true number was far higher, perhaps more than 100. She claimed she had no financial motive. Instead, she described her crimes in terms that combined both power and familiarity. She admitted that she derived a sexual thrill from watching her patients hover near death, from reviving them briefly and then letting them slip away again. She told investigators that her life's ambition was to kill more people, hopeless people, than any other man or woman who ever lived. Her words painted a portrait of a woman who was both calculating and compulsive, whose crimes had been driven by a blend of desire, jealousy, and fascination with the boundaries between life and death. In June 1902, Jane Toppan stood trial in Barnstable County, Massachusetts. The proceedings were followed closely in the press, with the newspapers across the country reporting on the unusual case of a woman serial killer. Jane insisted on her sanity. She argued that she knew what she was doing, that she understood the difference between right and wrong, and therefore could not be considered insane. But the jury disagreed. On June 23, 1902, she was found not guilty by reason of insanity, and she was committed for life to the Taunton Insane Hospital. There she would remain for the next 36 years. Life inside the asylum was quieter than the storm that had preceded it. Jane lived out her days among other patients, no longer able to inflict harm. Over the years, reports on her behaviour within the institution varied. Some accounts suggested she remained cheerful even in confinement, while others noted periods of melancholy and agitation. She died August 17, 1938, at the age of 81. A long life spent in large part within the walls of an asylum, far from the homes and hospital wards where her crimes had taken place. The question that lingers is why? What drove Jane Toppan to commit such acts? Some have labelled her an angel of mercy killer, a type of murderer who exploits the role of caregiver to target the vulnerable. Such killers often justify their actions as acts of compassion, ending the suffering of the sick and the elderly. But Jane's motives were different. Her own words revealed not mercy, but desire. She admitted that she gained pleasure from the act of poisoning, from the control it gave her, and from being close to her victims in their final moments. She sometimes poisoned people for convenience, to remove a housekeeper, for example, or to eliminate a rival. But more often, she killed simply because she felt compelled to do so. Her case also raised questions about the medical profession of her time. In an era when nurses and doctors had wide access to powerful drugs, oversight was limited. A determined individual could exploit that trust with devastating consequences. Today, Jane Toppan is remembered as one of America's first female serial killers and one of its most prolific. Her crime shocked the nation at the dawn of the 20th century, challenging assumptions about gender, trust, and the boundaries of sanity. She lived in a time when women were rarely suspected of violent crime, and when the idea of a female killer acting from compulsion, desire, and cruelty seemed almost unthinkable. Her case forced both the public and the medical community to confront uncomfortable truths, though she died forgotten. Her story remains a chilling reminder of the potential for darkness in unexpected places, even in those entrusted with care. Jane Toppan's life began in hardship. The daughter of immigrants, abandoned to an orphanage and left to navigate a world that offered little support. But from those beginnings, she emerged not as a victim, but as a predator. As a nurse, she gained the trust of patients and families, only to betray them in the most profound way. As a caregiver, she wielded the tools of medicine as instruments of death. And as a woman, she defied the stereotypes of her age, becoming one of history's most infamous serial killers. In her own words, she aspired to kill more people than anyone else who had ever lived. Whether she succeeded, we will never know. What is certain is that the name Jane Toppan, Jolly Jane, endures as a chilling chapter in the history of American crime.